Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. Good morning. It's good to see you all again, and thank you for your loyalty. I think lovely to see familiar faces. 2 out of 5, 1 out of 5 so far, anyway. First of all, as far as the microphone is concerned, is that acceptable, the volume? Can everybody hear? And the second question is, yesterday you were kind enough to allow us to turn the lights out entirely, given the short projection length and the small size of the screen. Would that be acceptable to you today if we were to? Yes, thank you very much. Well, let's get underway then. So yesterday we saw how Claude Monet was able to revolutionize landscape painting. And today we're going to look at this man, Pablo Diego José Picasso y Ruiz, to give him his full name, omitting several saints' names that he was also given. Pablo Picasso, unlike Monet, who revolutionized landscape painting, he revolutionized the way objects were painted. The revolution that he started has been likened by some art historians to the greatest revolution since the Renaissance in Western art. And although the Cubism with which he is identified was just one facet of his extraordinary talent, that opened like a watershed and allowed... are we all right? Oh, I'm sorry. Somebody was kind enough, and we had an electrical engineer yesterday who told me not to handle the aerial. I apologize to him for my slow learning capacity. And so revolutionized art for the 20th century and no doubt for beyond. What he said was, when I look at an object, I don't paint what I see, but what I feel. I separate the components of the object in order that I may be aware of what is at the side and behind. And this was his thinking, that one wants to get away from a flat two-dimensional view. And thus, Cubism, as we know it, was born, a short-lived experiment, and I'll explain why it was an experiment and not a fulfillment in its own right. Looking at that picture, his friends were absolutely appalled. Gertrude Stein, the American collector, said, "It was too awful." Sergei Scheherazade, who was a well-known Russian art collector, said, "It is a great loss for French art." And Henri Matisse, "A mockery. He will pay for such an outrage." But experimenting as he did, breaking away from pure Cubism, the Cubist vocabulary remained, leading to Guernica, which everyone, I think, acknowledges as one of the great masterpieces of the 20th century Western art. So who was this Pablo Picasso? This is a picture taken of him when he was 8 years of age with his sister. He was born into a middle-class family in Malaga, in Andalusia, in Spain. His father was a mediocre painter, working in the local Malaga art school, where he did drawing and painting, and he was also curator of the local museum. He recognized that his son was adept at drawing, and Pablo would take great pleasure in cleaning his father's brushes at the end of the working day. So he was in an artistic environment. His father was a rather morbid man, tall, thin, of few words, fond of animal and flower painting. And they lived in a small apartment with a little balcony overlooking a square in Malaga in which he kept homing pigeons. And this is just some of the pigeons that he painted. His morbidity became rather more severe when he was actually dismissed from the post of curator of the local museum simply because of funding lack, and it was closed. He was therefore quite pleased. In fact, at that time, sorry, thank you again. So, you know something, you have to explain to me many, many times, but when I get it in a flash. so he was a little bit, he was saddened when he was actually dismissed from his post as curator of the museum. And consequently, he had to undertake restoring other people's pictures in order to make ends meet. He was therefore quite pleased when he had an offer to move from sunny Mediterranean Malaga to La Coruña, which is on the Atlantic coast of northwest Spain, a damp, dull, and rather sad, miserable place with dreadful climate. Nonetheless, he was appointed to the local Coruña school, where he was able to earn a reasonable amount of money. Young Pablo entered the local school there, and there he was notorious for his inability to spell, and I understand that handicap remained with him all his life, which is quite extraordinary. The economic advantages that they had living in Coruña were offset by a tragedy that befell them, because Pablo was the oldest of 3 children. We saw him sitting there with one of his sisters, but his youngest sister, Conchita, developed diphtheria and within the week died. And this plunged the family into a state of great depression, of course, and the father blamed the dreadful weather in La Coruña for the death of his daughter. He was therefore very pleased to receive an invitation from a friend of his, painter friend of his in Barcelona, who was retiring, asking if Picasso Senior, Ruiz in fact Senior, would be interested in taking his post in Barcelona, and the opportunity to return to the sunny Mediterranean was of course very desirable. There, the 13-year-old young Pablo was entered into the local school in Barcelona, which was a notch up from the school in Malaga. It was a fine arts academy. And here he scoured through the library of pictures and what they had on display, came across this portrait of a Spanish lady in traditional dress by Corot, and used this as a model for painting his aunt Lola, the youngest sister of his mother, who was unmarried and living with them. Here he paints his remaining sister, Nola, who is taking her first communion. And that is the only picture we actually have of Picasso's father standing beside her. For his end of 16 years old, his end of class examination, he produced this painting, which he called Science and Charity. You can see somebody sick in bed there, the physician taking her pulse on the wrist, a nurse carrying a baby. And in a way, this was Picasso's tribute to his sister, Conchita, who had died. His teachers at the academy in Barcelona were sufficiently impressed with him that they encouraged his father to enroll him in the San Fernando Royal Academy of Art in Madrid, the most prestigious art school in the country. And at the age of 16, he was admitted to a senior class because of the skills that he'd already demonstrated. Yet, in Madrid, at the Royal Academy School, after 4 months, he became disillusioned with the quality of the teaching, uninspiring, he thought, and like many a student, he went off to the Prado, sat in front of paintings that attracted him, and of course, any student would be expected to make a fair copy of a painting by a grand master. He saw paintings by Velázquez, Zurbarán, and Goya. And this is a sketch that Goya did as a preliminary painting for the Carlos IV royal family picture, with which you may be familiar. And so instead of just doing a simple copy of that, we get an idea of how Picasso's mind worked, because rather than that, what he did, this is Carlos IV, and here is Picasso painting himself as Carlos IV. And on a preliminary sketch, a preliminary drawing that he did of this, he wrote, "Yo, Picasso, I am Picasso." 16 years old, can you believe? He was also very much enamored, understandably so, of El Greco. And this is El Greco's painting in the Prado of a Spanish nobleman. And likewise, rather than just making a fair copy, you can see that El Greco has given him a rather an intense look, obviously very direct, straight at the viewer. And here's Picasso's copy, in inverted commas, of El Greco's Spanish nobleman, here, even more intense than El Greco had actually done. His teachers were absolutely frustrated with him because he was hardly ever in class, but when he did do anything in class, they were full of admiration for his drawing. So he subsequently wrote, so if I draw as well as Raphael, that's what they said, and I believe they're right, I should have the right to choose my own path. Pablo Picasso, aged 16 years. Well, there's a Yiddish word, chutzpah, I think, but, perhaps chutzpah means that you're not really qualified, but he was qualified, so perhaps I should withdraw that. He exhibited some of his paintings, made a little bit of money, but obviously Paris was where the action was. Barcelona was a little bit of a backwater, the other side of the Pyrenees. Paris, 1900, was where the action was in art. And he came across a friend from Spain, Pedro Manache, standing there with his arms folded with suspenders, as you can see, and the young 16-year-old Picasso sitting in a wicker chair there with a brush and a palette. Manache was an interesting man. He was a painter, but also fancied himself something of an art dealer, or rather a go-between between real art dealers and young artists. And he happened to know Ambroise Vollard, who was probably the leading art dealer in Paris at the time. And he introduced Picasso to Vollard. Vollard looked at his work and said, oh, my boy, you clearly have some talent. Produce some decent work, and I might give you a show of your own in my gallery, which for a 16 or 17-year-old was obviously quite something. He traveled to Paris from Barcelona with his friend, Carlos Casagemas. Carlos and Pablo had shared a studio in Barcelona, and Picasso was rather in awe of this young man, something of a dandy, as you can see. He came from a well-to-do family. Not only was he an artist, he was also a poet, but a highly strung one. And the two of them remained good friends. He lived independently in Paris. And meanwhile, Picasso had a problem because you don't get an invitation from the leading art dealer in Paris to have your own one-man show at the age of 17. So he's clearly got to come up with the goods. And Vollard wanted 48 paintings. Well, Picasso, not shy and up to the challenge, thought, well, goodness me, I have no idea what I should be painting. He was obviously far too immature to have developed his own style. So he did a quick hot footing around all the galleries of Paris to see what was on sale and what was on show. He came across the Moulin de la Galette by Renoir and a similar painting at the same venue by Toulouse-Lautrec. And so he goes up the hill of Montmartre to find Moulin de la Galette, sees the people there dancing in their dance hall, and does this painting rapidly. I must say, to my eye, more in the style of Edvard Munch than either Renoir or Toulouse-Lautrec, but nonetheless quite striking for capturing the atmosphere. He then discovers that further down at the bottom of the hill of Montmartre is Boulevard de Clichy, where the Moulin Rouge had opened just a few years later, a much classier joint than the working class Moulin de la Galette at the top of the hill. And there, Toulouse-Lautrec, of course, had made famous the can-can dancers. He'd seen some of Lautrec's work in the galleries, and he does his own version of that in exactly the same way that he outdoes El Greco with the noble Spaniard. He sort of outdoes Lautrec here. The billowing skirts, and it's almost as if the legs of the can-can dancers are actually detached from their bodies. Like Lautrec, he left a lot of bare canvas, or cardboard in Lautrec's case, and here Pablo does a self-portrait of himself suitably dressed for the Moulin Rouge, I might say, because that was a venue frequented by the Prince of Wales. So there he is in his frock coat and his top hat, portraying himself as something of a gentleman. He discovers that Edward Degas is a hot topic among the galleries. You remember Degas was particularly interested in bathers and dancers, not so much for the female body, so much as the movement that these bodies actually undertook. And here Picasso does a Degas for Vollard, more interested, I think, in the bed and its bedclothes and unmade state than the actual bather herself. Degas did an absinthe drinker, you remember, and here he does an absinthe drinker even more intense than that Degas had actually produced, constantly sort of outdoing the masters who he admires. And even has a go at still life, can you believe? This is Cezanne, but instead of apples, he decides to put on the platter there oysters and slices of lemon. For the show, he said to Vollard, can you believe this, 17 years old, it is important to Monsieur Vollard that for the show I produced a body of work, I hope you will like it. I would like at the entrance to the show this self-portrait. And I would like it on an easel illuminated so people would know that this was me. And he portrays himself with a flamboyant orange cravat and a white top there, as you can see. And the hallmark of Picasso is this intense gaze from his dark eyes, which led him to have numerous affairs, as we'll discover shortly. He did produce one original work, I think, although with a debt to Gauguin, and this is his dead sister Conchita, who used to play with father's pigeons on the balcony in their apartment. And there she is clutching a pigeon and lost in her own dream world, a rather tender and highly original, really the first original Picasso painting, I think, that we've seen so far. Picasso and Casagemas remained close. They weren't sharing a studio or accommodation in Paris, but Picasso was becoming increasingly aware that Casagemas was becoming a little bit emotionally unstable. And this was all to do with an unrequited love affair with his model. And Casagemas took to drinking, took to drugs, and feeling responsible for his friend, he accompanied him back from Paris, back to Barcelona, so he could be with his family and hopefully in a more secure environment. So they traveled back together, Pablo feeling quite concerned about his friend. And unknown to Picasso, 3 weeks after he had returned, Picasso stayed to see his family in Barcelona. Casagemas returned to Paris. He did so in order to host a dinner party at the Hippocrane restaurant on Boulevard de Clichy in Montmartre, inviting Germaine, his unrequited lover, to dinner together with some of their friends. They sat down, the waiter came, they ordered their dinner, and while the food was coming, Casagemas got up to make a speech. And he just said how nice it was to be with everybody, put his hand in his pocket, took out a revolver, and shot himself through the right temple. This is a painting, a sketch that Picasso did some years afterwards, deeply, deeply affected by the death of his friend, whom he had tried to save from himself but did not succeed. This heralded a dark period in Picasso's life. He was very attracted to El Greco, and here's an El Greco painting, typical elongated forms and this blue color that El Greco was so fond of. And this launched really Picasso into a period in which he painted nothing but blue for the next 3 years, reflecting the somber mood that he felt. And here is the first of these paintings. It's the Burial of Casagemas. It's based on the burial of Count Orgaz that you may have seen in Toledo in that little chapel by El Greco. And at the bottom of the picture there, you can see in a white shroud representation of Casagemas's body, and around them, rather like a mourning Greek chorus, his friends in blue. If we look above there, we can see the Virgin Mary and a child, and in fact, 2 children. And instead of angels, we have ladies without any clothes on, some with stockings. I leave it to your imagination as to who they might be in this burial picture. The white horse ascending to heaven on its back with Casagemus there, being embraced by a prostitute as he goes. So a sacrilegious altarpiece, if you like. But this is Picasso, a man of abundant self-confidence. But more seriously, he launched into this rather morbid blue phase of painting. There is Casagemus himself with his lock of black hair, Germaine, his lover, resting on his right shoulder there. And note that Casagemus is wearing briefs to hide his genitalia because the source of the unrequited love was his apparent impotence. In the background, we can see on a bed there, two lovers, and to the right, a mother and child, what might have been, perhaps. And crouched in the middle between them is a picture of despair. And here, in a painting called La Vie was the name of the previous painting, and this painting is called The Tragedy. It's enigmatic because we don't know what the tragedy was, but in the same blue, a barefoot family standing on a beach, a mother with downcast eyes, father looking for all like a Greek god or a Greek philosopher with his curled beard there, and a child tapping his father on the left thigh there as if he wants to ask him a question. The sea is empty and so is the sky. What is the tragedy? We don't know, but it's a reflection of what was going through Picasso's mind. And here he paints an old guitarist, redeeming the blue for the first time with just a little bit of color, the beige of the body of the guitar, but very much El Greco-like with the elongated features there. And this lasted for 3 years, this phase. Interestingly, let me just go back one for a second. Interestingly, he gave all these paintings to Ambroise Vollard, who was very keen to show them, but not one of his blue paintings sold. Things perked up brightly for Picasso when he met a young model who was the picture girl, the cover girl for saucy postcards that were all the rage in Paris in the first years of the 20th century. Fernande Olivier was her name. She was tall, she was beautiful, but none too bright, and this suited Picasso very nicely because all his relationships with women required that he was always in domination over them. Was a wonderful housekeeper for him, and they lived together for 8 years, doing so in a little battered house up on the hill of Montmartre with little chimney coming out of the top and washing hanging out. And one of his friends said to him, "Your house looks like the laundry boats on the Seine." And he consequently named his house Le Bateau Lavoir as a consequence of that. He painted Fernande here, sitting rather wistfully on the right of the picture here, looking away from us. And here his palette brightened a little bit. He was out of his blue phase, and here he's using pinks and beiges, and he's depicting here a family of saltimbanques. I never knew what a saltimbanque was, but it's a traveling acrobats. And here he represents people he knows. Picasso himself, he paints himself as the Harlequin on the left there, much taller than he is in real life. Next to him, the tubby fellow with the comical hat, a jester's hat, is the poet Apollinaire, who was a friend of Picasso. And the rather skinny little fellow in swimming trunks with a burden on his back is Max Jacob, a Jewish poet who was also a good friend of Picasso. And although it's a happier picture than the blue ones that we've seen, it's rather a sad one as well, because here are performers trying to eke out a living. So there's a little push and pull about this painting, but certainly happier than the blue ones that we have just seen. Here is Fernande painted in a black mantilla, beautifully done, I think. And when Picasso became unquestionably the most famous and wealthiest artist of the 20th century, he repeatedly said, looking back to his time with Fernand in the Bateau Lavoir, was the happiest time of his life, even though they were so poor they could afford no heating, and that if he had a mug of tea by his bed at night, in winter, in the morning, it would be frozen. And yet the happiest time of his life. And I think we can all relate to that. It's a time of heightened sensations. My own mother, for example, living through the Second World War in London, said it was the best time of her life, even though it was terrifying, because your senses are so on edge. And so it was, I think, for Picasso. It is hard to believe that Picasso was only 23 years old when he had accomplished all of this. Quite extraordinary. And then he met this lady, Gertrude Stein, the one who was appalled at the first Cubist painting that we saw earlier. And she became one of his greatest patrons. She claimed that she sat for this portrait with Picasso 80 times, clearly an exaggeration, but the problem Picasso had was rendering her face. He painted it out, painted it again, sat, painted it out, never could quite get it to his own satisfaction. And finally, he did end up with this portrait here, with a mask-like face, rather stony, almond eyes, one larger than the other, you can see, and a rather narrow horizontal mouth. His friends looked at the picture and said that Gertrude Stein looks nothing like that portrait. Don't worry, said Picasso, she will. He was inspired, in fact, by that mask-like face, by a sculpture that he'd seen in the Louvre of an Iberian person, we don't know quite who it was, a queen or a goddess, we're not quite sure which, with this mask-like face. And I think you can see immediately the resemblance between Gertrude Stein as portrayed there and this 400 BC Iberian sculpture. He then paints himself in the same vein. Here is a portrait of the artist with self-portrait with a palette and the same mask-like face. So clearly his mind is on the stretch all the time, looking for ways of portraying himself. And at that time, the first years of the 20th century, what was all the rage? We had gone past the phase of Japonism in the late 19th century, early 20th century. Masks from Africa and Oceania were appearing in many galleries around Paris. And Picasso was quite struck with the intense emotion that could be achieved with very simple means, such as here. And it was with that in mind that he created for his own private consumption, not for sale, this large canvas in oil, 8 feet by 8 feet square. It depicts 5 figures, as you can see, rather totem-like, with the sort of angulation and elongation that we saw in that sculpture. The 3 figures on the left, this is actually a brothel scene, he said. The 3 figures on the left are looking quite calm, whereas the 2 on the right, the upper one there and the lower one peering through a parted blue curtain, as you can see, are looking much more somber, more anguished. And you can see the one at the bottom, for the first time, he's representing a face seen in 2 planes at the same time, or very, very nearly so. And the sharp angulation of the shoulders, the breast, and the drapery. And this was an experiment. A friend, he kept this in his studio, and his friends would come to the studio to meet and discuss. And one of his friends, André Samuel, said, "Oh, well, that's very interesting, Picasso. I've never seen anything like it. What have you called it?" And he said, "Oh, I haven't given it a name." And he said, "Oh, well, we've got to give it a name. Why not let's call it, for no particular reason that I can understand, Les Demoiselles d'Avignon." And there it is, remained in his studio for 9 years, and only exhibited in 1916 for the first time. So this was an experiment. So he's not a commercial artist, Picasso. I think we can take that for granted. That his mind was working, never wanting to do the same thing twice, pushing the boundaries. And that's what makes Picasso such a difficult artist to get hold of. We can think of Monet with his scintillating light and everything else. Any other artist you care to name, an image comes to mind. But with Picasso, it's difficult to know what image because he was in so many different styles. But why he was so renowned and so seminal for artists who followed was because he broke the mold and encouraged other artists to do so. He freely admitted his debt to Paul Cezanne. And here is one of the many paintings that Cezanne did of Mont Saint-Victoire, you can see there. And what impressed Picasso so much was the way that Cezanne did not render hedges like hedges or trees like trees. He just did sort of blocks of color, a bit of purple, a bit of green, a bit of orange, a bit of yellow, houses, and done in a similar way. And then he saw Cezanne's painting at a major retrospective exhibition in 1905 in Paris. And he also came across some writings that were exhibited at the same time. And among the writings of Cezanne explaining his approach to art was this statement that resonated with Picasso. Cezanne wrote, "Dealing with nature by the cylinder, the sphere, and the cube makes one realize nature exists more in depth than on the surface." And it's the latter part of that sentence that stuck with Picasso, the concept of getting away from two-dimensional representation. So you can see how things are building up to end up with classical cubism, which we'll see in a moment. In that same exhibition, he came across Cezanne's bathers, and here we've got 11 or 12 bathers nude. Not all the body habitus are the same, but essentially we're looking at bathers seen from all different angles. And paying attention to what Cezanne had written, he then has his own attempt at representing these bathers in one single image. And here she is. It's just a single bather, not a well-known painting, but in fact, I think a seminal one as he begins to explore the whole Cubist idea. And you can see here she is. He's respecting Cezanne's edicts that you should look at nature in terms of cylinders. Look at the cylindrical arms, for example, the spherical breast, the spherical abdomen, and the spherical buttock. But what is striking, we're looking at the buttock both in profile and almost beyond profile, and at the same time, she's posing 45 degrees towards us. So here he is trying to capture the in-depth concept in this simple painting. So here we have one of the most interesting relationships that lasted for 3-4 years between two very unlikely individuals. Pablo Picasso, the short, dark, intense Spaniard, quite volatile and very adventurous, teamed up with a stolid Norman Frenchman, Georges Braque. Georges Braque came from a family of house painters. And he was actually apprenticed to be a house painter and consequently respected craft. He was meticulous and slow, unlike Picasso, who was quick and impulsive. He was meticulous and slow, respecting the craftsman's skill. And yet, surprisingly, they became not only firm friends, but went on to explore the whole concept that Picasso, from Cezanne, was beginning to develop. Braque later wrote that he and Picasso were like two mountaineers roped together, which is rather lovely, I think, because you would think there would be rivalry between them. Picasso went back to Barcelona. Braque had seen Les Demoiselles d'Avignon in the studio, scratched his head, didn't know what to make of it. But while Picasso was away, Braque does a little experimentation on his own. And this is a painting by him, a port in Normandy. You can see he's used the same color palette as Picasso did in Demoiselles d'Avignon, the pale blue, pastel blue, grays, the beiges, and the yellows there. And let me just see if I can get the pointer to work. I'm not at the most advantageous angle for pointing, but I think you can see here there is a lighthouse. Here there is another lighthouse. And here 2 boats have come into the harbor, one bare-masted here, and from this curious distorted angle I'm standing at, not easy to see, but another boat has come in with its sails still up. And here are the rocks in the harbor like the breakwater. So I think you can just about make out what Braque was about on this painting, but you can see he's used this sharp, faceted, like little bits of the elbows of the Demoiselles d'Avignon. He's experimenting. And now he's experimenting even more Pablo Picasso was in Barcelona during this time. And although Pablo Picasso is given credit for inventing Cubism, I should say sort of sotto voce that I think it's actually Georges Braque, because there is a time difference between what Braque did here and Picasso did when returning to Paris. And here Braque has painted just a guitar. Can you see the guitar there, the strings? Let me struggle again with the angle here. The strings of the guitar, the open face here, the body, and up here, I have to look at my screen here to see, yes, there we are. And up here, perhaps the head of the guitarist. It's all very difficult to see. There is a merging of the guitar, the instrument, the back and front of the instrument, the side, with the background. As an artist, you're still concerned with aesthetics as well as theory. And I think you would say that there's something harmonious and pleasing about it, just as a piece of decoration, for want of a better word for the moment. So this is Braque ahead of Picasso in this respect. Picasso comes back, sees what Braque is doing, and does his own first true Cubist picture. And I don't think it's anything quite as good as Braque did, I have to say. But here is Seated Nude by Picasso. Can you see, might be able to see this one better. Can you, oh dear me, I'm going completely berserk here. There we are. One more, sorry, I thought that was the pointer. There we go. And you can see the arm of the nude here, her hand, her head multifaceted, blending with the background, her other arm draped across her thigh here. And rather adhering to the sort of Renaissance principle here, Picasso hasn't let go of classicism. We can see that she's illuminated from the side as if she were a Renaissance painting. And here he does a standing nude, and I think you can see straight away why that single bather that he did, modeled on Cezanne's 11 bathers with the buttock there, he's reproduced that same buttock here in his standing nude. So this is all experimentation, and that's why I called the talk the Cubist experiment, because it was just an experiment. And there's the standing nude, and I think you can probably pick out bits of anatomy for yourself on that. Ambroise Vollard, the one who gave Picasso his start with his 48 paintings in his gallery, here he is modeling for Picasso a portrait of Ambroise Vollard. And you can see that his whole body is dissolved into the sort of shards of the background, so we're not quite sure where he is and where the background is. But what we do see is his large, intelligent forehead and his rather dour aspect. And this is very much the personality of Ambroise Vollard. And then Picasso goes one stage further. He says, this is a painting that he now does of the dealer Henry Kahnweiler. And I'm hard pushed to see any bit of anatomy that I can recognize in this, but I think if you really do look hard, you can just about make out a triangular kite-shaped face, an eye here perhaps, some wavy hair. So we're on the brink of complete abstraction, but not quite. Braque, meanwhile, is the two mountaineers roped together. In fact, their work at this stage was so similar, they left their work unsigned, and people have had great difficulty knowing for certain which was Braque and which was Picasso during this period of experimentation. And here's Braque with a mandolin player. You can see a lady's hand there. Can you see that? Do I need to point that out? A lady's hand there. Coming up to the strings of the mandolin and her face up there, using an oval format, again an experiment, in order to focus attention to what's within the picture. And then Picasso goes right up to the point of abstraction. This is a painting he called Still Life with Bottle of Rum. And I showed this to a friend of mine who immediately spotted the bottle of rum, which I, for the last year, have failed to identify. And, oh, come back. There we are, let me get this right. The bottle of rum, there is just a little curved line there coming down perhaps the neck of a bottle. I'm not sure I'm showing you quite the right thing. But notice that he's added here letters. And this is highly significant because Picasso realized he was on the brink of abstraction, but he was a man of principle. And he held that any artist must always root his work in the observed world. And that really eliminates pure abstraction. And so Picasso had now found himself in a cul-de-sac with Cubism, and it wasn't really, there was nowhere for it to go other than pure abstraction, and as a matter of principle, Picasso couldn't go there. He was very reluctant to talk about his work, but he eventually was persuaded to try to explain what it all was about. What is this Cubism that you're struggling with to portray? And he said, reality in Cubism is not something you can take in your hand. It is more like a perfume in front of you, behind you, to the side. The scent is everywhere, but you don't quite know where it's coming from. Isn't that lovely? And I think that sums up beautifully, and this is why I call it the Cubist experiment. And in keeping with the time, this is a portrait of the early 20th century French philosopher Henri Bergson, who among his other writings argued that the human mind does not compartmentalize past, present, and future, but we're always mixing them up whenever we have a thought. And just pause for a moment and just think of anything, something that happened to you this morning. It relates to something that happened in your past, and also there are implications as to what might happen in the future as a result of what happened this morning. And this was what Henri Bergson was all about. And in a way, I can see a parallel, the sort of spirit of the time, that Bergson was thinking philosophically, and Picasso was addressing the same question, not so much of time, so much as perception of objects. But again, the past, the back, the present, the front, the future, the other side, if you will. Perhaps a bit of a stretch, but it's something I just put to you as a thought. Well, the purism of Picasso and Braque is admirable, but younger artists had to make a living. And the whole concept of Cubism became a sort of device for other artists. And here is Robert Delaunay, with his eye to the commercial market, who introduces color and is bold about representing things that a potential customer can recognize, and you can recognize there easily the Eiffel Tower, and to its on the right-hand bottom part of there in orange, part of the Moulin Rouge, a scene between, on a boulevard in Paris between two buildings. So Robert Delaunay was adopting the Cubist vocabulary, but with an eye to the market. Fernand Léger, who was enamored of machinery, adhered to Cezanne's maxim of cylinders. He latched onto the cylinder, and I'm sure you know many of his paintings, cylindrical-looking people working in cylindrical-looking factories on cylindrical machines. Here's one of his early works here, which he called The Smoker, and down below you can see an eye and a face and cigarette smoke going up in cylindrical form. So in other words, it's not representing the smoke of a cigarette rising to the air so much as using that as a peg on which to explore the Cubist vocabulary. And here's Jean Metzinger, who was among the young people, the most intellectual of the young experimenters, using the Cubist vocabulary there. You can see in a painting that he called The Dancer. I think it's on the sheet there, exactly what the name is, but the Cabaret Dancer. Can you see her? I'm terrified to press this button and get it all wrong again. But I think you can see her face here, nicely represented. Legs and a flowing gown here. And over here you can see some lace work, which is a lady. Here's a hand with a ring on it. Can you see another hand across her here? A musical instrument here, perhaps, we're not quite sure. All fragmented up, using richly the Cubist vocabulary, but speaking in his own voice here, and also with an eye to the market. And Marcel Duchamp did many works which he called Nude Descending a Staircase. He was enamored of movement and photography. And here he's using the same Cubist vocabulary in his own special way, portraying it's like a sort of stop-action image of a nude walking down a staircase. I think you can make out little bits of her, but it's the concept that matters. Well, we saw yesterday how Monet, an exhibition by Monet made the front page of the national newspaper, and I said only in France. Only in France would the Parliament devote a whole debate to the direction of art. And they did. And this is this is in the Assemblée Nationale in 1912, in the Chambre des Députés. Député Charles-Louis Breton rose to his feet and said, "These Cubists are launching an assault on the French heritage, and they are mostly foreigners." Well, he was right in the first part, but he was wrong in the second, because almost all of them were Frenchmen. with the exception of Juan Gris, a young disciple from Spain who came to do the affectionate portrait of Picasso, and Picasso himself. So among the dozens who were doing Cubist paintings, they were just about all Frenchmen. So where was Picasso going to go now? Because he'd reached a cul-de-sac. He would not on principle go into abstraction. So he backed off a little bit using the shard concept, and he invented something quite new in art, Western art, which is the collage, where you start with a canvas or a paper or whatever and add things to it, bits of paper, bits of cardboard, printing, stand, stencils, bit of cloth, a feather, whatever. And here he just starts going off in this direction. Again, what a restless mind, and why he's such a difficult artist to pigeonhole, because just about everything he did was unique and highly inventive. The First World War is upon us. We're now at 1914, and as a consequence of 1914, his friends were all called up, mostly Frenchmen, and he accepts an invitation to go to Rome to work on a Messine ballet to design the sets and costumes. Jean Cocteau invited him, and they went together. And there's Picasso sitting there with his friends designing the scenery for this ballet. There he meets a Russian ballerina, Olga Kokoschka. Picasso himself is feeling emotionally very vulnerable for his lover, Eva Hubert, had died at the age of 30 of tuberculosis just some months earlier, and he was emotionally very vulnerable. And she was a bit of a go-getter. She knew that Picasso had a reputation. She was Russian. She claimed to come from a noble family, but in fact, that is doubtful. But the long and upshot of it all was that they were shortly to be married. She accepted Picasso's proposal of marriage. And he remained married to her for many, many years, although he had many, many affairs in spite of that, as we shall see in a moment. What to do next? He'd done collage, he'd done cubism. What to do next? He'd always admired Renoir, the sensitive nude, and he thought, well, he hadn't done nudes, so let him try nudes. But while in Rome on the ballet project, he, of course, saw the sculptures of Michelangelo, the paintings of Raphael, and was very taken by the classic form of the Renaissance body. And here he does a series of nudes now, but monumental, not sensuous like Renoir, as you can see, almost as if they are sculpted. And you can see here that this girl, this solid bather, very solid-looking girl, is sitting on a chair draped with a cloth that looks as though it's been chiseled out of marble. The critics were absolutely delighted that they could recognize something that Picasso was doing. Because they were wrestling with how to write a critique of this, for example, which is a collage of Picasso Harlequin, which he'd done some years earlier. So they were great relieved and thought, well, at least we can critique his human figure and the nude. How wrong they were. Because no sooner had he done the nude there than he does this painting, which looks like a collage, so it's a painting looking like a collage, looking like a painting, which he called The Musicians. Jazz was all the rage, and I think you can see there's a sort of jazzy feel to it without knowing quite what it's all about. And it takes a moment or two to get your eyes focused on exactly what we're looking at there. There's a table in brown there, and you can see there are three figures with masks. Can you see that? On the right-hand side in black is a representation of Max Jacob, that little man with his bathing trunks and a burden on his back we saw in the Saltimbanque pink picture that we saw a little earlier on. And he painted him here in black with a rope girdle because Max left his Judaism to become a monk. And there he is. So for as far as Picasso was concerned, he was lost to the circle. In the middle, with a clarinet, can you see, with a black mask and a white sort of tricorn-looking hat in front of the music there, is Apollinaire we saw in the Saltimbanque as well. And poor Apollinaire was wounded in the First World War, having been drafted, only to recover, but then to die in the Asian flu epidemic in 1918. Picasso portrays himself as the Harlequin in the red and orange and yellow there, you can see, holding a violin, a bow in his hand with a violin up to his chin. So as you put it all together, at first sight, a jazzy, happy picture, but in fact, it's a lament for friends who are no longer with him. Rodin's Kiss, you know, I'm sure. This is Rodin's kiss à la Picasso, or should it be au Picasso? He was asked about his marriage. He'd been married to Olga. Olga Kokoschka was a very ambitious woman. After all, she was quite vulnerable. She was an émigré in Paris in 1917 at the time of the Russian Revolution, had lost her imperial passport and wasn't in Russia to apply for a Soviet passport, so she was essentially stateless, and that was what precipitated the marriage to the vulnerable, emotionally vulnerable Picasso. But they lived together, but she was constantly pushing him and demanding this and demanding that, and Picasso's head was in the clouds and always thinking of new projects. And a friend asked him, what was it like to be married to Olga? And he said, imagine two lovers fighting wrapped in barbed wire. And this is a painting that he did about that time. The precipitating factor for the separation from Olga, in fact, was meeting this young lady, a student of art, 22 years old. Picasso was already in his 50s, and a blonde girl. Her name escapes me for a second, I do apologize. Marie-Thérèse Walter, thank you. I was prompted there. Marie-Thérèse was, unlike Olga, was a thoughtful, attentive, loyal companion to Picasso, and actually gave birth to his daughter, Maya. And they remained together for 8 years, eventually went their ways, but there was profound respect between the two of them, and they remained good friends for both of their lives. Here he paints affectionately two lovers representing himself and Thérèse. 1936, the Spanish Civil War. What about Picasso's politics? Well, he was really an apolitical being, but the precipitating factor was the advance of Franco's forces and the employment of Italian fascist and German Nazi troops to help Franco against the Republicans. And he took a stand against that. And when Franco ordered the bombing of Guernica, the Basque town in the north of Spain, by Italian and German warplanes, the first time that civilian population had ever been deliberately targeted in warfare, Picasso was incensed. And his reaction was to change a project he'd been given for the 1937 Pavilion exhibition in Paris, the 1937 International Exposition in Paris. He was charged with a mural for the Spanish Republican Pavilion at the time. And he changed the project, as we'll see in a moment. Guernica itself was totally destroyed. Its population of 7,000 people, 1/3 were killed or seriously injured. And Picasso's response was Guernica that we'd seen a little earlier. It's a huge work. It's 14 feet by 20 feet long in black, white, and gray. And on it, let me just take you through it, because at first sight you can recognize the Cubist vocabulary, I'm sure, but I need to stand in a place where I can see. I hope the microphone behaves itself. We can see it's a complex painting. Here's the sun or a lamp, whichever you like, surveying the scene, beneath which is a horse baying, crying out, stabbed in the back by a lance. Can you see here? Here is a woman's head screaming as she leans out of her balcony, her arm with a torch here. And here is another woman whose apartment is on fire. And here a broken man, can you see, crying out in pain, his limbs broken as he reaches for a flower. And here a woman in anguish holding her dead child. So I think you can see that it's a harrowing picture, and as you absorb those details, come to appreciate why it's become such an icon of the 20th century. The Second World War was upon us, and unlike his friends who were drafted, Picasso remained in his apartment in Paris. Here he is leaning out of the window in 1942. The Gestapo were aware that he had Republican sympathies, and raided his apartment on 2 occasions, suspecting he was a spy on behalf of the Allies, but he was left unscathed and not arrested. In 1943, he met another girl, another 23-year-old girl. He was now in his 70s, and she wanted to be a student of Picasso's and learn painting. And this was, of course, Françoise Gillot, who is famous for having written a tell-all book about her life with Picasso. They lived together for 10 years. She was the mother to 2 more of his children, namely Claude and Paloma. They never married, and she constantly nagged him to divorce Olga, which he didn't do, and marry her, which she wouldn't do. And eventually, following another affair, they were to separate, but were together for 10 years. Paris at the end of the war, 1945, 1946, was rather an austere place. They went down to the south of France, and there they lived away from the town. And Picasso then developed a new way of looking at painting. But in the interim, 1944, he had joined the French Communist Party. He was already an enormously wealthy man, and his friends couldn't understand. It was a paradox that a wealthy man should join the Communist Party. But the truth of the matter probably is that this was more a political gesture of solidarity with the Republicans than a true belief in the communist ideology. In 1951, the Korean War was raging, and this painting, which is based very, very closely, I'm sure you may recognize, on Goya's The 3rd of May, 1908, in which partisans who were trying to get rid of the Napoleonic occupation of Spain were lined up and shot as reprisal for attacks on the Imperial Guard. So Goya's searing painting is almost reproduced item by item here. In place of the Imperial Guard, you have these automatons anonymously assassinating citizens in front of a rock, just like in Goya's painting. And this was used as a demonstration. America was going through this dreadful McCarthy phase, you remember, and because he was a member of the Communist Party, he was persona non grata as far as the American authorities were concerned. And this painting was used as an example of his anti-Americanism. But like Guernica, this painting, War in Korea, makes no reference to Korea, and the other makes no reference to Spain. It's the universality of the brutality of war as it affects the civilian population. And I think he deserves full credit for that, and everything else, I think, is a red herring. Picasso's relation with the Communist Party is very interesting. In 1956, Khrushchev, you remember, denounced Stalin, and this had a startling effect on party members. Picasso never renounced his membership of the Communist Party, but he really was never active in it. And in 1962, he had no compunction accepting the Lenin Peace Prize in Moscow, which is just an interesting aside. What to do in his last years, then? And what to do in his last years was controversial and difficult, really, to understand. A man of so many parts, doing so many different things. He refers back, he never ever wanted to repeat himself, and think how many artists do repeat themselves time and time again. He never wanted to repeat himself, but he respected the great painters. And here he goes back and makes his own version of Las Meninas of Velázquez, of Delacroix, the Algerian painting. And here he uses the same, we've just seen the Goya that he reproduced. And here we can see this, I think you would probably remember from yesterday, is Edouard Manet's Déjeuner sur l'herbe. And here's his version. And people asked, why was he doing this? He was now in his 80s. Why was he going there? Was he just burnt out and had nothing else to do? Was he wanting to put his own take on this? And I think the real answer, to my mind, having thought about him for some months in preparation for this, was that all his friends had died. Matisse had recently died. He was now the last survivor of his generation. And somehow he felt an affinity with these great men and wanted, in a way, just to feel the comfort of walking in their shoes. Perhaps a sentimental interpretation, but it seems to make sense to me. And then he, in his last years, he was able to churn out painting after painting after painting, often 2 or 3 a day, and basically these have all been dismissed, except now there's a sort of revisionist way of looking at Picasso and trying to find merit in these. This is the artist and his model. In his final years, he moves to the little village of Vallauris which you may know in Provence, full of the lavender fields there, where he comes to an arrangement with the local pottery that he will design the pottery and the pottery will actually do the manufacturing for him. And that he does, and he spends his last years basically in Vallauris doing pottery. And there he meets in the gift shop of the pottery a young lady, Jacqueline Roque. This is number 6, I think. And Jacqueline was in her late 20s. He was in his late 70s at the time, or coming up to 80. And eventually they were to marry. She was 34 and he was 80. And they were to marry because I think that Olga had died. He didn't actually have to divorce her. And much to the great chagrin of Gillot, Francois Gillot, she came to visit Picasso in the chateau in which he lived in his last years at the foot of Mont Saint-Victoire. There is the chateau itself. And she lived there with the Jacqueline, and Francoise Gillot, the mother of his two other children, would come to visit periodically so the children could still remain in contact with their father. And every time that she came, she badgered him to marry her, marry her, marry her. And you can imagine her reaction when she discovered that he'd actually married this young assistant in the shop in the Vallauris pottery. Picasso was actually buried in the grounds of his chateau there. And sad to say, at his funeral was Jacqueline, his new wife, young wife, a priest, 2 friends, and 1 representative of the local Communist Party, the richest and most famous artist of the 20th century. So what is his legacy? You can't really get your hands around this man because he was so inventive, so inventive. Credited with inventing collage, yes. Co-inventor of Cubism, yes. But more important than that, he freed the artists of the 20th century, freed their mind to have confidence in themselves, to explore territories that they never thought they would dare go. In the realm of painting, the realm of sculpture, and can you believe, the realm of architecture. And here is a Cubist church just beyond the Ring Road in Vienna, in Austria, as a tribute to Picasso. And I think we can probably conclude with Picasso's advice to young artists: explore, explore, explore. Never forget, all art is a lie that makes us realize the truth. Thank you.